Good morning. Protests are normal. Social movements, protests across the board move the needle economically, politically, socially. They move the needle in macro terms. They change the way we think about our consumption habits. On a regular basis, whether you turn on the TV or you turn to Twitter, social movements and protests, disruptive politics are making their voices heard. I prepped for this talk and I was getting ready to talk about Hong Kong. Then I was going to talk about San Juan, two very important issues we're going to hear more about in a little bit. And then I had to update my talk to talk about what? Barcelona, Santiago, Beirut, and before that, Gezi, Maidan, before that, Occupy Wall Street. And we'll hear more about San Juan today. Hong Kong is in all of our minds. Protests on a regular basis are changing the way we think about our lives, the way we think about our cities, and sometimes the way we think about ourselves. So I want to convince you today that protests are normal and that we should make place for them in our cities, more places and better places in them for our cities. This is a counterintuitive sort of argument because we often tend to think that politics is normal. It usually works. We all know what politics is, what normal politics are. I guess it's hard to imagine these days, but imagine what you used to think usual politics looked like and go back in your imagination. But you all are from cities, and so as it turns out, cities are better run units of government than some other forms of government, other units of government. And so you can congratulate yourselves on being part of units that work. But everywhere else, it turns out normal politics do a hit or miss job at identifying how to incorporate new voices, how to incorporate new ideas. Democracies are dynamic places with constant flows of new ideas, constant flows of new economic realities, new political realities, new people coming in the form of birth, new generations with new ideas, new people coming from other places in the form of immigration. And democracies sometimes struggle to find ways through the normal political process to adapt to these changes. That's one of the reasons I'm arguing that we see the sort of disruption on a daily basis that I mentioned earlier. This status quo, some status quo approach to politics and to transforming norms and values into public policy, struggles to keep up with these new calls for new rights, new recognition, new resources that draw on public spending, or sometimes the status quo actively blocks these calls, the sorts of calls that come from valued but ignored members of our community or members of the community that are intentionally ignored. So if the status quo doesn't always work in identifying these rights, demands for rights and recognition, then what do? I want to argue to you today that we need to work and do a better job at making cities that invite disruptive debates about what makes our democracies good, what makes our democracies worth fighting for, and how it is that we can work across very, very large differences to have difficult conversations, maybe before things get to the street, let's say. I started thinking about all of this on the streets in Budapest. I was documenting together with citizen journalists and a team of mine that uses drones to document events like this. We were documenting a protest against a tax on the internet in Budapest, €1 per gigabyte, not a lot of money, but it hit the rich and poor, young and old, pensioners and students, and everybody turned out onto the street to protest. The prime minister said it was the same old cranks and anarchists, and they were at it again. But people in the street knew what I knew there in the middle of that crowd, or seeing it from the sky, which is that it was everybody. Everybody had turned out. The people whose pocketbooks it hit had turned out on the streets, young and old, wealthy, not so wealthy, managers and owners of businesses, as well as employees and pensioners. So eventually, the protesters got what they wanted. The prime minister had to cave because we released footage like this that demonstrated it wasn't the same old cranks and anarchists. It was, in fact, everybody. So the protesters declared a victory. The prime minister took a hit. The policy was spiked. But I left this thinking, what is the actual role of protest size on public policy or on public perceptions of key events and key issues that we need to think differently about if we're going to have a dynamic democratic debate. So it turns out that this movement caught the attention of the international community and they won. So turnout size matters, they decided. Now, you don't need me, a sociologist, to tell you that turnout size matters. This is something we know intuitively. It matters for politics, it matters for optics, and it matters for public policy. So if we're going to have, if turnout size matters, it turns out that good social science suggests that when you get 3.5% of the people onto the street non-violently, they're more likely to get what they are demanding than if they demonstrated violently or if they had much smaller turnout. So 3.5%, if you're community organizing in the room, 3.5% is the gold standard for turnouts for events like this. Now, as anybody who's ever organized communities can tell you, 3.5% is a small percentage, but it's a huge number of people, especially when you get to the level of cities. That protest in Budapest was 60,000 people. So that's 3.5% of the country's population. 60,000 people is a lot of people to mobilize. We're seeing much larger events in the cities that I had mentioned earlier, 300,000 people in some cases, million in others. We have estimates now coming out of anti-Brexit protests in London. Lots of people showing up. So 3.5% is this sort of gold standard. And it signals that people are serious, enough people, and enough different kinds of people are serious. It's not just one constituency. It's not just one group of claimants. When you get to 3.5%, it turns out it looks more like everybody. So this raises a new question. Where should we actually be having these sorts of protests? Now, traditionally, these sorts of protests have always happened in cities. Why? Fairly simple reason for this, I don't need to tell you. Cities have people, lots of the right kinds of people, students, activists, artists, a creative class, academics. They've got people coming from the countryside and consolidating in groups that are all of a sudden interest groups, or people coming from other countries and representing themselves in new ways as political votes, political blocks, and with economic pressure. So we've got the right people. We've also got communication channels in cities, formal communication channels like television, newspapers, radio, social media, and informal mechanisms for spreading the word like word of mouth, posters, flyers, graffiti, asphalt art. We have other ways of spreading the word. And on top of this, there's a place to gather. There's a downtown, there's a plaza, there's some place that people know where to actually go. And if it's a capital city, the place people know to show up is in front of the halls of power. But I'm not just talking about capital cities or the halls of power. I'm talking about the 600 cities that saw a women's march last year, or the 1,000 cities that saw climate action this year. So I'm not just talking about capitals and halls of power, I'm talking about the cities that all of us call home. So the question is, if there is this kind of activity on the streets of the cities we all call home, how do we create new space for this sort of activity to emerge? We've gotten better and better over the last 20 years as city managers, I should say you all have, and mayors, and managing crowds and protests so they don't turn violent, innovated in ways that keep protesters sort of in special spaces where they can actually protest safely. These oftentimes are separate from the places they're actually the targets of their protest. So we've done better jobs with permitting, better jobs with essentially cordoning off protesters, but this separates important critique and important dynamic debates from actually ever spilling out into public. So we have better ways of permitting, but we need ways of thinking about, I don't want to say unpermitted space, about loose space. So it got me thinking about unassigned space. Where can we find spaces where people fill in with creativity, actual physical space? So it got me thinking about whether or not there's something we can learn from Burning Man. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer has started writing that maybe urban planners can learn something from the urban planning that happens at Burning Man. It's a flash city of 70,000 people where urban planners lay out the grid and the people fill it in. And all you need to do is Google Burning Man and take one scroll on Google and you'll see that people fill it in a lot of different ways. And that's not the urban planner's job. The urban planner's job is to lay the groundwork and do it in a way that's intelligent and people fill it in. The free city of Christiania at the edge of Copenhagen, Denmark, is another space. It's an intentional anarchist community in which people who did not want to live under the repressive strictures of Copenhagen could be free. So I'm not saying that this is what marijuana's been legal for a long time. It's an autonomous collective. It's run collectively. It does not look like Copenhagen, and nor should it. And Copenhagen doesn't need to look like this place. The question is, do our cities have places, free places, open space places, where people can play at the edges of what freedom looks like, what democracy looks like, what new forms of identity look like, what it means to live together across great differences on purpose and constructively? And we should be making a place for this kind of thinking in our cities. And the reason for this is there are other ways to build cities. Louis XIV used the Great Fire of Paris as an excuse to widen the boulevards of Paris so they could be less easily blocked by barricades, the kind of barricades you may remember from Les Mis. Robert Moses, architect of the New York City, in many cases city planner for New York City that we kind of remember, that we think of, the iconic New York skyline and this sort of thing, had bridges into Manhattan built so that public transportation couldn't enter them, but private cars could, essentially putting a class barrier onto entrance into Manhattan from outer boroughs. The cobblestones on the streets of Hong Kong are superglued to the ground so they can't be dislodged and used as projectiles during protests. There are other ways to build and plan our cities that close off space to political debate, political discourse, and important conversations across huge differences. So how do we build cities that are safe for people, but also welcoming of deep and dynamic, vibrant, disruptive debate about what makes open societies that are fundamental for human flourishing? And what I want to leave you with is that protest is normal. It's happening in our cities already. We should make new and better space for it in our cities. And the reason this is important is that when people take to the streets, enough people take to the streets, after having not been listened to in the space that we've given them for long enough, and they take to the streets in sufficient numbers, they win. Thank you.